Welcome to this week's episode of Reading the Gospels Through Hebrew Eyes. Luke chapter 18, verses 9 and following are going to be our focus today. It's the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector. Now, hopefully by the time we get through with this, you'll have a little bit sharper image of what this parable is really all about, because some of the language is a little bit difficult to bring across in English translation, and particularly when we get to the prayer of the tax collector, which is usually translated, God be merciful to me. We'll see that there's a bit more to this verb than simply showing mercy. And we'll also, in order to shed some light on the details in this parable, take some trips back into the Old Testament. We'll draw on some non-canonical Jewish literature like First Enoch to better help us understand some of the language that's used. And really the thrust of this parable is going to be about competing, I guess you could call them worldviews, which Balthasar, a Roman Catholic theologian, has referred to as the Ego-Drama versus the Theo-Drama. So an ego-drama is where everything's about me. I. The whole world and the story of my life revolves around me, versus the Theo-Drama, where it's all a focus upon God and what he gives and what we then stand to receive from his good and gracious hand. So that's what we're taking a look at. Let's go ahead and dive in with these first couple of verses from Luke chapter 18, verses 9 and 10. He also, that is Jesus also, told this parable to those who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and treated others with contempt. 2 men went up into the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. So right away, let's take a look at this language of trusting in themselves. What exactly is that drawn from? What does it imply? So let's take our first trip back into the Old Testament with Ezekiel chapter 33. So the Hebrew verb translated there as trust can also mean persuade and lots of other things depending upon the context, but here it has the implication of trust. So they trusted in themselves. That's the language of Ezekiel 33:13, where God says, "Though I say to the righteous that he shall surely live, yet if he patho." Now this is the Greek translation we're looking at here, the Septuagint. Yet if he patho in his righteousness and does injustice, none of his righteous deeds shall be remembered, but in his injustice that he has done, he shall die. So Ezekiel 33 is using this same language in the Septuagint of trusting in himself, trusting in his righteousness, despite the fact that he is engaged in sinful behavior. Now, this same kind of language, to jump into the New Testament, is used by St. Paul in 2 Corinthians 1:9, where he writes, "Indeed, we felt that we had received the sentence of death." Of course, he's talking about all the sufferings that he has endured. So he felt like he had this death sentence. But what was the purpose? That was to make us patho, rely or trust not on ourselves, but on God who raises the dead. So they couldn't trust in themselves, but instead they they trusted in the God who is the life giver, the one who raises the dead. So it's really a question of where you put your trust. And there's really only two options. You either put your trust in God or you put your trust in something else, someone else. So faith is either directed to the true God or faith is directed towards something which is false, untrustworthy. But of course, everybody puts their trust in something. As we'll see, the Pharisee put his trust in himself, in his supposed avoidance of evil deeds and his works of supererogation, these extra super works that he was accomplishing, in which he was trying to even do more than what he thought God required of him. So he put his trust in himself, and the tax collector realized that he had nothing to put his trust in. He was basically dead. He was spiritually impoverished. There was nothing to put his trust in but in the God who gives. So he trusted in himself, and he looked down on, he despised others. Now, the Greek verb there is exothero, to despise, to treat with contempt. So Luke, in his 2 volumes in the New Testament, the Gospel and the book of Acts, uses this verb 3 times. Once in the parable that we're looking at, where the Pharisee treated others with contempt. Now, interestingly, in the other 2 usages, it's in reference to how Jesus was treated with contempt. So Herod with his soldiers treated him, that is, treated Jesus with contempt and mocked him. And then in Acts 4:11, we have a reference back to Psalm 118. This Jesus is the stone that was rejected, that it was treated with contempt by you, the builders, which has become the cornerstone. So in Luke's use of this verb, every time it's in reference to either Jesus or, in this case, to the tax collector. Now, both of these men, we're told, at the beginning of the parable, they went up to the temple to pray. This, of course, was the typical spot in Jerusalem, at least, where pious Jews would go to pray twice a day, once in the morning at the time of the morning sacrifice, and then once kind of mid-afternoon at that sacrifice. If you read the opening of Luke's gospel, you have the priest Zacharias. He's burning incense, he's praying, and the people are gathered outside waiting for him. Why are they gathered outside? Well, this was the time of prayer. And the temple was located at a higher elevation, and so that's why you went up to the temple to pray. Of course, people could pray anytime, anywhere. They usually did this facing Jerusalem because that was where God had located himself in the temple. This was the house of God. But if you were in Jerusalem and you were able, you went to the temple, into the courts of the temple, and you prayed toward the house where God had located himself, where he had promised to hear. So that's kind of the context that we're dealing with when these two men go up to the temple to pray. Let's see what happens as the Pharisee begins his prayer. So this is Luke 18, 11, and 12. The Pharisee, standing by himself, now we're going to talk about that translation and what that implies in just a second. The Pharisee, standing by himself, prayed thus, God, I thank you that I am not like other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give tithes of all that I get. Now, what I want to do is I want to walk through the prayer of the Pharisee, who he is, and then what he says, just step by step, in order to make sure that we're fully understanding the implications of what he is praying here. Because if we just kind of skim past this and just say, oh, he's just full of himself, it wouldn't be wrong, but there's more to it than just that. So let's begin with who he is, the Pharisee. Now, unfortunately, this is already going to make it a little bit difficult for us to understand what's happening here because, of course, when we hear Pharisee, we hear a pejorative title. If I'm called a Pharisee, that, of course, is never a compliment. Or if I say of someone else, they're acting in a pharisaical sort of way, of course, that's not a compliment. It's an insult. However, if you're a first century Jew and someone refers to you as a Pharisee or you're doing something that's Pharisee-like, that's good. That's actually perceived as a positive thing. So you could say that the Jewish mamas wanted their babies to grow up and be Pharisees. This was not a bad thing. They were kind of the paragons of zealous, religious, Jewish virtue. So if you were a Pharisee, you were looked up to because you were someone who was very, very serious about your faith, very serious about tithing, very serious about fasting, very serious about praying, very serious about the study of Scripture. You were a highly religious, esteemed member of the Jewish community if you were a Pharisee. Of course, I know there were exceptions, but broadly speaking, Pharisees had a good reputation among the pious. All right? So don't think negatively of this. When Jesus probably was saying a Pharisee stood up to pray, most of his hearers would have been saying, oh, yeah, this is going to be a good prayer because the Pharisees are good people. So that's the first thing you need to get into your head is that the Pharisee, to most of the hearers of this original parable, was the good guy, not the bad guy. Okay? Now, let's see what he says. He's first of all, okay, he's standing by himself. Now, that Greek phrase, pros he auton, has been understood in basically three different ways by commentators. It can either go with the verb standing or the verb for praying. So, standing by himself is a possibility, like he's kind of standing apart from everyone. And by the way, standing is the typical posture of Jewish prayer, and that's still the posture of prayer in the liturgy of most churches today. So on Sunday, if you're in a liturgical church, probably you rise to pray. You stand up in order to pray. So he's standing. Now, it's also could be, and these other two are the other, I think, more realistic possibilities. First of all, praying to himself. Now, it's a possibility, but I don't think it's a probability. Praying to himself just doesn't kind of fit with the whole thrust of what is happening here. But the third one does, praying about himself. So pros auton can be translated, he was praying about himself, which of course fits exactly with what he's actually doing as you begin to listen to his prayer. Now, what's going on here? Well, I mentioned at the onset of the video that this is kind of really about an ego-drama or a theo-drama. And as you see from the prayer, this guy is all about the ego-drama. He's all about himself and what he's doing. So just take a look at all the I's there. I thank you that I am not like other men. I fast twice a week. I give tithes of all that I get. So I. He's all into himself. He is living the ego-drama. He begins his prayer by mentioning God, but as soon as he gets past that, he begins really to be thankful for himself and all that he's done and all that he's avoided doing. So it's a prayer, at least formally, but it's more like a self-eulogy. He's eulogizing. He's speaking good words about himself. Then he says he's not like other men, and he gives us a list here. Extortioners, so that's, of course, two of these are directly related to the commandments. You shall not steal, and you shall not commit adultery. So he's not like extortioners, that is those who commit robbery. He's not like adulterers, or he's not like the unjust. That's probably adikos is a Greek word that kind of is a general term for those who are unrighteous. So sinners in general, all right? And then he gets to the very end, and it's almost like he kind of cast a sideward glance over to the tax collector and says, this tax collector, that this probably is pejorative in nature too. This tax collector. I'm not like him either. So that's his list. So he's setting himself, of course, this is comparative righteousness. He's looking at himself, he's looking at other people, and he esteems himself highly in his own eyes because he sees that he's not like these other people. He doesn't go around robbing. He doesn't go around sleeping with other men's wives. He doesn't lead an unrighteous life. He certainly is not like one of those backstabbing traitors who are pawns of the Roman government who are taking not just our taxes, but a lot on the top as well so they can stuff their own pockets. He's not like any of those people. He leads a pious, outwardly righteous life, avoiding evil. So that's the first thing that he says. And then he's going on to tell us the good works that he does. And these are, number one, he fasts twice weekly. In Robert Stein's commentary on Luke, he points out that this is the earliest reference to the Jewish practice of fasting twice a week. Later on, we learned from the Jewish Talmud that the 2 days of fasting are Monday and Thursday. So he fasts twice a week, even though, according to the Jewish law, the only annual day in which you have obligatory fasting is Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. That's the only day in the Jewish calendar where you're required to fast. This guy not only fast, of course, on Yom Kippur, but 52 times a year, twice a week, he's fasting. So over 100 days per year, this guy is having only bread and water, which is the typical food and drink if you're fasting, or just water, either way. And not only that, but he tithes of all I get, he says. That means probably, now this is by implication, not only does he tithe everything that he earns, but he even tithes on everything that he purchases. Because you never know, the person that he bought something from may not have originally tithed on that item. And so he's going to tithe not only on his paycheck, as it were, but also in all the things that he purchases as well. So this guy is basically saying, God, I thank you for me. In fact, you, God, is this kind of the implication of this. In fact, you, God, should be thankful that you have me on your team because I'm such a good person. I'm not like these other people, including that tax collector. And not only do I follow the dictates of the Torah, and not only do I live according to the traditions of the fathers, but I go above and beyond what is required in order to fast twice a week and give tithes, not only the things I receive as a paycheck, as it were, but also those things which I purchase. So in in the clearest terms, Jesus is set up here, this guy who's not only an average believer, but he is some sort of hero of piety. At least that's the way that he sees himself. And that's the way that a lot of other people would have seen him as well. So remember, the Pharisee in this original context is the good guy. And now we're going to get to the bad guy, at least the bad guy as he was perceived, the tax collector, the publican. So let's see what he does, what he doesn't do, and then what he says. Verses 13 and 14. But the tax collector, standing far off, would not even lift up his eyes to heaven, but beat his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. And then Jesus wraps up the parable by saying this, I tell you, this man went down to his house justified rather than the other. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but the one who humbles himself will be exalted. Let's first of all talk about what he doesn't do. He won't even lift up his eyes to heaven. Now, this is unusual because we have other gospel accounts which tell us that prayer typically was offered with one's eyes lifted up to heaven. So, for instance, if you look in Mark 6:41 or in John 11:41, or if you go back to the Psalms, to Psalm 123, verse 1, one's eyes are lifted up to God, lifted up to heaven when prayer is offered. But we have, for example, in 1 Enoch 13:5, this is talking about the fallen angels, the watchers. What do? For from thenceforth they, the watchers, could not speak with him, with God, nor lift up their eyes to heaven, for shame of their sins for which they had been condemned. So the watchers won't lift up their eyes to heaven. They're ashamed of what they've done. Ezra, too, in Ezra 9:5-7, uses this language. So at the evening sacrifice, he rises from fasting with his garment and his cloak torn. So he's looking like one who is penitent. He's outwardly doing those things that a penitent does, one who is sorry for his sins and the sins of the nation. He spreads out his hands to God and says, Oh my God, I am ashamed and blush to lift my face to you. Why? For our iniquities have risen higher than our heads, and our guilt has mounted up to the heavens. So keep in mind that traditionally, when one prays, it's not just your heart or your mind that prays, but your body prays as well. I mean, we're familiar with this. We kneel in prayer, or we stand in prayer. We fold our hands. We put our hands apart. Some traditions make the sign of the cross. There's all different kinds of ways in which our body is involved in prayer as well. So the very fact that the tax collector wouldn't lift up his eyes to heaven, but was beating his breast, the sign of penitence, this is the way in which his whole self, not just his heart, but his whole body is involved in this prayer. All right? Now, what does he say? This is a fascinating aspect of his prayer. It's translated here, God be merciful to me, a sinner. Now, the verb that's translated there as be merciful is hilaskomai. It's related to other words that we have in the New Testament, such as hilasmos, which is propitiation, or hilasterion, which is the name of the mercy seat, the place of propitiation that was in the Holy of Holies. Now, this verb is only used twice in the New Testament, here in Luke 8:13, and then in Hebrews 2:17. Talking about Jesus, it says he had to be made like his brothers in every respect so that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest in the service of God to do what? To hilaskomai, to make propitiation for the sins of the people. This is also the verb that's used in several of the Psalms in the Septuagint translation. So in Psalm 24, and by the way, the Septuagint numbering of the Psalms is one off. So in English, in Hebrew, this would be Psalm 25. The second one would be Psalm 65, so on and so forth. But anyway, in Psalm 24:11 in the Septuagint, for your name's sake, O Lord, hilaskomai, pardon my guilt, for it is great. Or in Psalm 64, when iniquities prevail against me, you atone for our transgressions. And then Psalm 77 and Psalm 78 talk about how God atoned for their iniquity or atoned for their sins. This is the language it's used by the tax collector when he says, God, be merciful to me. And since he's at the temple, since that's where sacrifices are offered, probably he has in mind the sacrifices that are being offered there on the altar. So, God, be merciful to me, by giving me the forgiveness that's acquired by these sacrifices, by which you are making propitiation or atonement for my sins. So there's a lot more packed into that than a simple request for mercy. Certainly, he's asking for mercy, but he's asking for mercy that's given by God as a result of atoning sacrifices being offered on the altar. So when we, as a parenthesis here, when we pray this prayer of the tax collector, we're saying, God, be merciful to me for the sake of the sacrifice that Jesus Christ has offered on the altar of the cross. That's the full implication of what it means for us to ask God to be merciful to us. And then Jesus wraps up by saying that this guy went down to his house justified rather than the other. Why? Because God is a God of reversals, right? Everyone who humbles himself will be exalted, and he who exalts himself will be humbled. This is basically the summary of the entire Old Testament. Over and over, this is the way that God works. You read about it in Hannah's song, for instance, in beginning of 1 Samuel. You read about it over and over in the Psalms, where what does God do? Well, the one who lifts himself up, like this Pharisee did, God brings low. He humbles. He kills. He brings him into death in order that, not that he might stay there, but that he might be enlivened by faith and then lifted up by God. So those who are humble, those who are low, are then brought high by God. Those who fill themselves up, those who are full of pride and arrogance and self-righteousness and trusting in themselves, God will pop their bubble. He will bring them low in order that he might, having humbled them, having stripped them of everything in which they trusted, having emptied out their soul of all of its self-righteousness, that toxin that kills us, emptying all that out, we are then fit receptacles for God to fill us with himself, which is exactly, of course, what he does for this tax collector. So that wraps up the parable part with the explanation and then this proverb about exalting and humbling. Now, there's one last section here that's included in some lectionaries, so let's quickly look at it. It's verses 15 through 17. Now they were bringing even infants to him that he might touch them. Mark has little children, I believe, but Luke has infants. These are babies. They were bringing infants to him that he might touch them. And when the disciples saw it, they rebuked him. But Jesus called to them, saying, Let the children come to me, and do not hinder them, for to such belongs the kingdom of God. Truly I say to you, whoever does not receive the kingdom of God like a child shall not enter it. So think about this. People are bringing, by the way, that picture is from Cronach, just a beautiful, beautiful portrayal of Jesus. I love the picture of him holding babies, bringing them to himself, putting his hands on them, holding them, and blessing them. It's such a picture of the heart of Christ. So what is it about babies? Well, you don't have to have raised a baby. You don't have to be a parent to know that babies have nothing to offer. Babies are entirely passive. You can tell them all day, do this, don't do that. Accomplish this, accomplish that. Do this task, don't do that task. You can tell them all day long whatever you want, and they can't do anything. They are entirely passive. They are completely receivers of everything that somebody else does for them. We feed them. We keep them warm. We protect them. We clean them up. We change their diapers. We put them to bed. We get them up. They cannot do anything on their own. Therefore, children are the paragons of faith because they are the quintessential receivers, which is exactly what it means to enter the kingdom of God. We don't come to God and say, hey, God, I got a few things to offer you. You might be interested in having me on your team. You know, I fast twice a week. I give tithes of all that I get. I'm not an extortioner, an adulterer, or even like that tax collector over there. No, we don't come to God with our CV, with our moral resume. In fact, we don't even come to God. He comes to us, and we have nothing to offer. We're exactly like the tax collector. He's the baby in the parable. He's the receiver. What does the tax collector have to offer? Nothing. All he says is, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. In other words, I have nothing to offer you, God. I am empty, completely empty. I am entirely dependent upon you. I need you, and I have really nothing to offer you. And God's like, perfect, because that's exactly what I'm looking for. I'm looking for empty vessels that I can fill. I'm looking for empty hands into which I can place my gifts. So babies are the quintessential picture of those who receive. And that's the people that enter into the kingdom of God. So we don't come to God bragging about our self-righteousness. We don't come to God offering this or that for him. We don't even come to God boasting about, oh, these great sins that we have. We just simply say, listen, I'm a sinner. I got nothing to offer you, God. And God's like, I have everything to offer you. I have my love. I have my forgiveness, and my salvation. I have my kingdom, everything. And I give it to you fully, gratuitously, fully in Jesus Christ. And we're blessed. We're blessed by the one who welcomes us the way that he welcomed those babies, the way that he welcomed that tax collector. He welcomes us and he fills us with himself. So that's this week's reading. Sorry I missed last week, by the way. I forgot to tell you. We had all kinds of things going on with our 1517 National Conference, the Hebrew Still Stand Conference, San Diego. So I was there half the week. Didn't have time to do a video last week. So sorry I missed that. Here I am back this week and fully expect to be back next week as well. Hope that you're doing all well. I want to thank you for your continued prayers for me and my family. They are greatly appreciated. My son's 22nd birthday would have been this week. So say an extra prayer for me and my family. Thank you. We'll see you next week. God bless.